Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. I've done well over 100 shows now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Today, my guest is Alkesh Parmar. Alkesh was one of the stars of the Material Matters Fair when we launched in 2022, and I'm delighted to say that he's returning to Bargehouse when we open our doors for the 2024 edition, which runs from the 18th to the 21st of September, so it's coming very, very soon. Over the years, the designer and researcher has hollowed out champagne corks and turned them into chandeliers, as well as transforming traditional Indian terracotta cups into light fittings, but he's best known for his work with citrus peel. Using material usually thought of as waste, he's created a variety of extraordinary products, including a juicer, for obvious reasons, and a lampshade. His practice combines craft with critical design, and I think it's fair to say he was a relatively early adopter in the design industry of working with local materials and questioning the effects of globalisation. When he's not working with waste, he's also a teacher at the Royal College of Art. Alkesh, how are you? Thank you very much for doing this.
Hi, Grant. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's a complete pleasure. Was that intro okay, by the way?
Yeah, very good, actually.
Oh, good. Good, I'm glad.
It's always interesting because I'm always recontextualizing myself. So I think that was a really lovely introduction. Thank you so much.
I'm glad. You looked for a moment down the screen like, no, that was all wrong. I was completely panicking. Anyway, we have a tradition on this podcast of finding out a little about where and how you work. Now, we met before this recording started, so I happen to know that you're not in your studio. You're at home at the moment?
Yes, I'm at home. So home is West London, Hammersmith. So it's a relatively new place that I've moved into. And I thought just for the purpose of the podcast to position myself here and not at my studio, which is essentially like 15 minutes away within the borough in Fulham.
Okay, well, let's cheat in that case. And let's pretend you're in your studio. How do you work? Are you tidy? Are you surrounded by fresh fruit? What goes on in your studio?
I would like to say I'm tidy, but there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of things in my studio. So, I surround myself with a lot of things from glass to metals, obviously oranges and orange peels, as well as other kind of organic materials. The studio itself it's not huge. The overall footprint is about 36 square meters. I tend to have a lot of shelving within the space where I can just put all my stuff, which includes things like electrical equipment and lots of random found objects as well. But yeah, I think I'm relatively tidy. It goes through cycles. And interestingly, I need to, before I start a new project, I need to do a deep clean of the studio. So it's something I always need to just to kind of have a reset and have things prepared before I start working.
Yeah. So you primarily, when you get into the studio on a day that you're there, are you primarily computer-based or are you working with materials the whole time?
I try not to be computer-based when I'm at the studio. I spend a lot of time in front of computers when teaching and doing other things. So I try to get into a habit of being in the studio and using that time to actually make and to tinker and to experiment.
I love the word tinker. I mean, you're exhibiting once again at this year's Material Matters Fair. It's a shameless plug, Alkesh, but which runs from 18th to 21st at Bargehouse, listeners. What will you be showing?
What will I be showing? For the fair, I've been currently working and doing a lot more research around the history of oranges, which I'm finding really interesting. So the origins of the sweet orange, which is essentially from the southern region of China, northeast region of India and Myanmar. But for the show, I'll be bringing in a lot of the historical aspect of the oranges within the work. So there'll be a series of wall pieces and, as always, a new collection of lighting pieces.
What is it with you and light? You have a fascination with light.
I do have a fascination with light. I think it comes and stems from my upbringing as a Hindu and the religious ceremonies and pujas that I've always grown up with, where light takes a center stage and provides a sense of warmth. It is used as a way to invite goodness and wealth. And for me, light has I have a spiritual connection to it, but I find it really magical and calming. So a lot of my previous work, and I suppose even more recent work, always incorporates light, both as a medium, but also as more from I suppose, a conceptual aspect as well. And I think for me, there's something really magical about with that moment where you create a piece and you turn the light on and it just takes a life of its own. And whilst experimenting with different light forms and different materials and the relationships they take on, again, there's a sense of kind of wonder. And it's one of those materials that we still don't completely understand, both natural light and artificial light. So I'm always really intrigued by it. Previously, I've done a lot of research and investigations around that, in that how light could be manipulated, different types of light could be manipulated, but also what the symbolic kind of significance is within when it kind of meets a medium and projects certain shadows and effects onto surfaces.
Interesting. I mean, I have to say, as I was kind of researching this is a slightly weird interview for me, and I'm quite enjoying it actually, because usually I'm surrounded by all the research that I've done, reams of paper full of articles about the person I'm interviewing, notes on lectures that they've given, the occasional TED talk, that kind of thing. But you kind of go under the wire, Alkesh. I mean, you don't even have a website. Is that deliberate? I'm guessing.
Maybe. I don't. And I feel really bad for that. I'm really terrible.
I don't mean to make you feel bad, by the way. Sorry.
I'm very, I'm terrible at promoting myself. And I suppose it's partly down to shyness. I think a lot of it is down to just being overly self-critical. And then more recently, I suppose, where creatives are kind of taking on their own marketing and self-promotion, I find it really difficult to kind of navigate in those spaces and present myself out there. But I am working on it, Grant. I am working on it. I do have a website, actually.
Oh, do you?
It went live last week.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear it. I will let my marketing person know.
I'm still working on it.
Then I'm intrigued. Have I put you in a difficult position? Do you find this kind of thing difficult?
No, not at all. I think it's just... I suppose a lot of it is creating those opportunities to present myself externally and present myself to other audiences. And that happens through shows and exhibitions and other events, but it doesn't really happen where I need to really make an effort to kind of put things out there in the public realms. It's good you brought that up. I just feel that at times I definitely could do better, and I should. I did have a website. I have had a website, but it just got neglected. So
okay, sorry. I feel like I've been your headmaster now. I feel bad. So look, let's move on to this material of yours. It's something that we generally throw away or preferably compost. Why orange peel? What are its properties that so interest you?
It's a question I get asked quite often. I suppose my answer to that has changed and shifted over the years, but the initial interest into orange peels was very simple, really. I suppose it was more being interested in the way in which the peel dried hard and didn't perish if you dry it out correctly. It kind of retains a form, it retains the color, it retains a scent. And that was it, really. It was just simple as that. And I think when I was doing my BA, I used to keep hold of my orange peels instead of throwing them away. At a point where I was encouraged to experiment with different materials and mediums, I decided to work with the orange peel and study the way in which it dried and the forms it took on during that drying process. And that was really fascinating because it behaves like leather during that period. From actually peeling the peel through to it drying out, there's different points at which the elasticity of the material changes. And then as it dries, it kind of takes on a form. It kind of retains a form. So initially I was really interested in the forms that it would take on and see whether I could actually control that and have more control over that.
In other words, Alkesh, it was like a practical, materially driven decision rather than I'm surrounded by all this waste, I must do something with it.
Definitely. I think a lot of my work is very much material driven. It's very much kind of being and engaging with the material, studying its properties, the way it behaves, and analyzing. And then through those observations, thinking about what they could be or how I could really push the limitations of them. And actually later, it was only later where the environmental aspect and the waste issue kind of arrived. And that was during my MA at the RCA, where I picked up orange peel again, not too long before my final year show.
Yeah. Which I remember seeing really some time ago. That's aging me a bit, actually. In terms of your process, I guess in the first instance, it'd be good to know where you get your peel from. I mean, I'm presuming you need more orange peel than you eat oranges yourself.
Yes, definitely, especially now. It wasn't the case when I first started. So I would just work with the waste I generated myself, and then peers would keep hold of and save their peels for me. And then, I'd arrive at the studio and there'll be a pile of orange peels for me to use. But that grew. And as I started experimenting with it more, I was running out of supply. So I started then looking at other ways of getting hold of the peel. So I ended up finding a fruit salad manufacturer based near Heathrow. So they would make fruit salads for the airline industry. So I managed to get in touch, went over. They had skips full of this waste.
What would they do with it, Alkesh? If you went there, taking some of it off their hands, I presume not all of it, that would go, landfill, or they were composting it, or what would have happened to it?
So back then, it would have gone to landfill. I would imagine now, with more regulations and companies trying to be more sustainable, hopefully have found better uses for it. But certainly back then, it would have ended up in landfill. That was then for me a turning point with the way in which I was engaging with and working with the material. So it kind of moved from being initial studies that I was doing in my kitchen at home, actually, Grant. It was something I started off on a very small scale in my kitchen, then took into the RCA and started utilizing the facilities available there. But what that did actually was opened up a lot of critical thinking about the waste and waste streams and where they end up and the emissions that they release into the environment. A lot of my mindset kind of shifted in not only about where the material was sourced, but also how this material that I was actually making was being created. So thinking about things like water consumption, molds, different binders and binding agents that I would work with initially, and I was working with initially. So a lot of that actually was fueled by the cradle to cradle framework. So the cradle to cradle framework, which was developed by the architect William McDonough and the chemist Michael Braungart, which integrated the design and science. So as a framework, it was very much about thinking about resources and how resources can be used for something else. It was a lot more than that. It kind of also picked up on the social and ethical aspects of production and manufacture. So that really kind of shifted the way in which I started working with the peels and thinking about the development of a material through more of a critical lens.
Interesting. Can we talk about the various processes that you use with this material to create the juicer, for example, which is, I think, the first piece I probably saw of yours. That might have been what you graduated with at Royal College. What steps are required to make that? Because you have kind of 3 different processes, I think I'm right in saying.
That's right. Currently 3 different processes. But so the juicer is essentially a composite material. So at the time when I was developing it, I basically was really intrigued by the way in which the citrus peel dried hard and stayed hard and didn't perish. So I thought, hang on, there's something in this material, something that this material is made up of. There's something in there that allows it to dry hard and retain itself. And I started to question whether I could keep those inherent properties somehow, but have more control over the form and the scale and the shapes it takes on.
What is it that allows it to do that, Alkesh? I mean, it's because it's mainly cellulose, right? Or orange peel, or any citrus peel, I guess.
Yeah, so the citrus peels are made up of cellulose. It has sugars, pectins. It's made up of a lot of different things. So we have the oils on the outside, the oil sacs, the white pith part, also known as the albedo material. So it has a lot of various different materials that it kind of contains within it. It was the pectins that I was actually really interested in. Pectins being sugar, essentially, which was kind of found in the walls of plants. The pectin is essentially a gelling agent, and it's most commonly used in jams, for example, and jellies. What I found really interesting is that where I'd use or break down dried orange peels into powder. I was then binding it with other natural binders, like agar or starches. And for me, I was questioning the fact that it was just another composite, right? I'm only using the waste as a composite, and it didn't really relate back to my initial inquiries of, hold on, why there's got to be something within the peel that makes it dry hard and retain those properties. So I worked at the time with Imperial College and I started doing more research. So this is where I suppose I became more of a material scientist and moved out of the kitchen into the lab.
Right. So just for a moment, can I just ask, the juicer, was that created in your kitchen or was that when you got into a lab?
That was created at the RTA. Okay. I don't have high-tech facilities in the kitchen to be able to do that. But the juicer itself, essentially, I take waste orange peel, dry that out, and then break it down into various different microns, ranging from 120 to 300. A part of the wet waste that I would collect, I was developing a way in which I could extract pectin. So the extraction of pectin itself can be quite complicated, especially for food grade pectin where you're using it for jams. But essentially, the extraction of pectin involves heating up the peels. It's the pith part of the white part of the peels that kind of contains most of the pectins. So it's kind of taking it up to a certain temperature and heating it up in distilled water and constantly checking the pH levels before it's then extracted through a gauze. And then you leave out this white milky residue to dry out. And then you essentially end up with a powder. Because I was working with not only the peel, I also had the membrane, the juice that was still left over from the juicing. It contained a lot more sugars. What I was able to do was to take the wet peel, heat it up and essentially create like a glue, a very sticky kind of residue. And then I was binding that with the dried powder.
Okay.
And compressing and using compression molding to compress it. Grant, that was, also took a lot of time to develop, and there were lots of failures in that as well. So where things didn't quite work out in terms of drying and cooling down and distortions. And I found those were really interesting as well. But the juicer itself was machined. It wasn't, pressed into a mold.
Okay. Well, so you milled it or something?
CNC machined it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The juicer makes complete sense because of the material it's made from. As I was thinking about it, I was guessing for someone who studied when you did, the juicer was quite a controversial product for a while because of the piece that Philippe Starck did for Alessi. It was a product that was generally loathed by product designers because it was all sculpture and no function. I was just curious, was that in the back of your mind when you decided to make one?
It definitely was. Yes, I almost felt that I almost was going to replicate that same juicer, but out of the composite peel. And then I decided not to. But yes, certainly was. I mean, it does raise the question about how many people actually use a juicer these days. And I guess the reason why I chose to create a juicer was more of a kind of a commentary to the industrial juicing where most of this waste was being generated and probably still is being generated. It was kind of thinking about this closed loop circle where we could think about ways or that the juicer would allow or create or encourage people to juice at home, retain and keep hold of their own waste to then enable them to create their own juicer or create more juicers. So in a sense, it was a way of kind of decoupling ourselves from the industrial juicing processes. But Philippe Starck's juicer definitely did cross my mind, and no further comments in terms of its practicality. And
I remember he described it as, he almost described it as something you weren't supposed to use, but as a present you were meant to buy for your mother-in-law. In fact, I actually did buy one for my then mother-in-law. So there you go. If nothing else, it might not have functioned, but he knew his market. So there you go.
Did, yeah.
There are other things, though, subsequently that you've done with the peel. Let's take, it's almost quite iconic. That word is overused. I think it's iconic. The lampshade that you've designed where pieces of peel look like they are stitched together. What's the process behind that?
So the lampshade that you're talking about, again, came after the composite, partly because I felt that I hadn't fully resolved my initial investigations with working with the peel in its kind of raw stage as it dries out and before it dries out. So essentially the lampshade uses the process of patchworking. I suppose that's the best way of describing it, where the orange waste, the waste peel is very time consumingly cleaned. Then I tend to wait for, let's say, like a day, depending on the weather. I sun dry them so they become semi-hard, and then flatten them out through just very simple kind of clamps and woods and wait for them to dry out completely. But what I was really interested in with the patchwork and the skin, as I like to call it, was those moments where the material and the peel wants to dry. So I felt that I could intervene in that process and wanted to have more control over that drying process. So essentially, I would work into the peels and sew them together on a domestic sewing machine when they're semi-dried, so they're not completely dried out, because when it's too wet, the peel is brittle. It just tears apart, and the needle and thread doesn't like to the peel doesn't like that, and it's too aggressive for it. And when it's too dry, it becomes brittle again because it becomes really hard. So it's finding that moment where it's malleable and leather-like, where you can actually stitch into it. The pendant itself was really challenging because for some reason I had in mind to create a spherical piece, a really kind of a globe pendant piece. And initially thought that would be quite simple because thought I could just create a mold and form it around that mold. But it proved to be really complex in the end, where I had to build it up by sections and form each section around a mold and then piece each section together. So it's very much about controlling and forming the skin before it dries, and kind of thinking about how far we can actually push and stretch that.
You also make paper and card from it. That's the kind of the third process, I think.
So I found a paper mill, a Frogmore paper mill based in Hemel Hempstead, and I went over there with lots of orange peel and asked them if they would be willing to try out some samples and create some paper. And they were really helpful. Jim there was extremely helpful. And we started developing some very basic paper samples, kind of moving through the different ratios. At the time we were using rags, so cotton fibers, because the cellulose and the fiber in the oranges themselves aren't as long as other fibers. So it kind of needed a bit more support.
Okay, so you're using rags with the orange as well? With
the orange. So essentially I got to a point, or we arrived to a point where I was able to use, I think it was like 60% or 70% orange pulp and 30% recycled rags. So that was really good. But, again, it was more of an inquiry and testing to see whether it would be possible to do. The possibilities for me with that and the different levels and the differences between those three different ways of working with orange peels is their value points. So, the skin patchwork peel is very crafted, is highly crafted. There's a lot of time invested in care that goes into those pieces. The composite kind of sits as a mid value where, it's perhaps more set up for small scale production. Whereas the paper can just go into production straight away. So you can just put the paper into existing paper milling.
You've got every market covered, Alkesh, from collectible piece of design to day-to-day packaging. Why are you talking to me? Go and make your fortune.
Well, I did try, interestingly, Grant. I did after the RCA. I went on through the incubator, the Innovation RCA. They held an incubator there. I think Carmen Hiyosa, who's been on here before, was also part of that, and she was incredibly helpful and supportive with everything. But I went on to develop build a team of people, create a business plan, and go for funding for the material, for the composite material. Although I was, managed to secure some funding, I decided not to continue with that. Partly because the material wasn't fully developed and ready to go into production or mass manufacture. I think it was just a bit too early and still needed more research and development. But honestly, at the point there, I thought, this is it. I've made it. This is it. This is something that's going to make me lots of money. But I think another reason why I came out of it is because I just didn't enjoy the shift from spending time inquiring and investigating and working with a material to all of a sudden leading a team of people and applying for funding and moving into that business space and thinking about patents and portfolios of patents and how we can kind of monopolize and create different machinery that goes into existing production, etc. So I lost interest in it as well. And I felt that actually I'd much rather and prefer to just go back to my studio and work with it on a smaller scale.
Hope you're enjoying the show so far. This is just to remind you that the Material Matters Fair runs from the 18th to the 21st of September at Bargehouse, Oxo Tower Wharf. There's going to be loads to see. As we've heard, Alkesh will be there and he'll be joined by, among other things, an installation on the future of textiles from Biotech's Future. Studio Tip will be using construction waste to transform our entrance. Transport expert Priestman Good is our design studio of the year. Hydro will be doing amazing things with scrap aluminium. AHEC will be there with work from Studio Party and American Maple. And look out for a collaboration between architect and designer TP Bennett and the Furniture Practice that investigates how materials are affecting the contract design world. The likes of Crafting Plastic Studio and Eco Lattice will be showing pieces at the cutting edge of material science. And craft is a theme that runs through the event, most obviously in the beautiful pieces of furniture by Irish brand Modet. And there'll be designers and makers working in everything from roots and recycled ceramics to mycelium and food waste. Oh, and there'll be talks too from the likes of Mark Miodovnik, Caroline Till and Jonathan Smales off the podcast, and loads of others in a space created with our official acoustic partner, Woven Image. It's all very exciting. The event is free for trade, but you must, and I repeat, must register in advance. The link is in the show notes. See you soon. I'm guessing when you first started taking an interest in what orange peel did when you dried it out during your BA that you couldn't have imagined however many years later, was it more than 15 years later, that you'd be still working it, talking to people like me about it?
No, not at all. I mean, I thought that was it after my BA, and it was only by chance I decided to work with it towards the end of my MA show. Again, even after that, I kind of parked it and thought, this is me. This is me and orange peeled done for now. But I just keep getting drawn back to it, Grant. I don't know what it is.
Drawn back to orange peel.
Yeah, it's just, I think I have to just accept that it is my material, and it's something I'm just going to have to spend the rest of my life working with, which I don't mind completely.
No, but in terms of how you work with it, there's like a thread of craft running through your background, I think. I mean, you've talked a little bit about the RCA incubator, but it really is now that's done and dusted. Thinking about it on an industrial scale is anathema to you.
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I feel at the moment with where I am and what I want out of my practice and the various different kind of ways in which I've worked with the material and also engaged with other projects. I'm kind of always between craft, art and design. There's kind of, I think a lot of my practice has always been kind of rooted within applied arts, which kind of naturally sits between the two. So I do at times like the idea of production work and batch producing pieces or having pieces that I can sell in shops, etc. But equally, I think what really kind of pulls me away from that is just an interest in wanting to continue to explore the material, because I feel I've only just scratched the surface and there's so many different ways yet that I want to go on and work with it.
Can we talk about your background, Alkesh? Because you were born in Leicester, I think I'm right in saying. What did your parents do?
So I was born in Leicester, born and raised. My parents, my mum was a homemaker, because there was 5 of us, total 4 siblings. And my dad by trade was a mechanic, but he also did lots of other things. He was essentially a jack of all trades. So he was known as a mechanic, but took on lots of other work. My parents moved to the UK in the 70s. They didn't really have a formal education. They came into the country knowing very little English. Things were difficult at times at home. You know, we weren't fortunate and had to really kind of try and find ways to get by and manage with such a large family and trying to kind of pick things up.
Were you making things? Was art part of the diet of your house?
So I wasn't really exposed to art in the sense of going to exhibitions or being surrounded by artworks, but I was always making things. I was always with my dad whilst he was either repairing cars or making up tools, creating his own tools to get a certain job done. So it'll be a lot of welding and grinding. So I've always been surrounded by making. So my dad was always very hands-on. Myself, I was always kind of interested in making. I wanted to get involved in those processes, and I wanted to help out. That, I think, is where a lot of my interest in making comes from. But also from my heritage, because I come from a Hindu caste system of shoemakers. So my grandparents were also shoemakers and did a lot of shoe repairs and repairs of leather accessories, etc.
So they had an influence on your practice. Is that too obvious a thread to pull on?
Not at all, actually. It's only recently that I've been kind of drawing on more of my heritage and the relationship between the leather and shoemaking and the making of leather accessories and repair to what I'm doing right now with the orange peel and stitching and sewing into that. So it's something that I'm kind of drawing more connections from and coming to a realization of perhaps actually that is where my interest with working with it in that particular way maybe comes from.
What was it like growing up in Leicester during the 80s, 90s?
I mean, I suppose for my parents, it would have been completely different. I think during the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of racist violence. I think the National Front were quite prominent at the time.
Yeah. Late 70s, there was a wave of National Front. Yeah. I can kind of just remember it in my childhood being on the news.
Yeah. Leicester was, I'm not sure if it still is, one of the first cities in the UK where the white people were the minority and the ethnic communities were the majority. So growing up in Leicester was really good because I had a lot of my family, so a lot of my dad's siblings were there. So I have lots of cousins and my family were based there. It was it's an industrial city, so there's a lot of surrounded by a lot of kind of textiles factories, and often I'd visit them where family members would work or manage them, or in some cases even own some factories. So I was surrounded by the machinery and things like that. But Leicester it's a small-ish city, and I feel very much, or used to feel very comfortable there. But I think as I grew older, I felt that it wasn't the space for me or the place for me to really develop a career in the arts. So I found that space quite limited.
Well, it's interesting because I was going to ask, because you decided to study at Leicester. You were keen to stay in the city at that point or stay home?
I was, yes. I mean, I think partly because financially it just made more sense to study in Leicester, but also because I really liked the program I went on to do for my BA, which was design crafts. And coming out of my foundation, I had applied for furniture design at Loughborough University, which I was accepted a place on. But also I was offered a place on the design craft program. It just made sense for me to do that program because I really wanted to still explore and understand what I was interested in. And that was certainly a really good place where, I had lots of facilities like glass blowing and access to metalwork studios and welding, etc. So that was again one of the main reasons why I decided to stay in Leicester.
I was intrigued by the name of the course because, I mean, you were marrying craft and design, or wanting to marry craft and design from a young age. Certainly,
yes. And I felt also at the time a lot more of those specialist craft programs were merging to more applied arts based programs. So maybe it was a point, I was part of a generation of creative people who wanted to broaden their practices as opposed to kind of specialize their practice so early on. And that was a relatively new program when I started. I think I was second year in when I started. And it was fantastic. It was great. I absolutely loved it. 3 years of really experimenting, exploring and trying to kind of discover and understand where my interests lie as well. So it was certainly the right decision for me at the time.
And was it always part of the plan to go to Royal College? Was that an ambition?
No, not at all. I didn't really know about the RCA until my final year. So the head of program, Jackie Oliver, at the time, head of program.
Oh, okay.
Obviously went to the Royal College. Kim Sutherland also taught there, went to the Royal College. And the visiting lecturer who, I really got on with, Andrew Smith, also went to the RCA. And it was only in my final year, they were like, mainly Andrew was like, you need to go to the RCA. that's definitely the place for you. So it was only then I got hold of the prospectus, and that was my Bible, essentially. I was looking over it, and that reassured me. And when I went to the open days, found out more about the program, I was kind of umming and ahhing between design products and what is now the jewelry and metal program. But I decided to stay within the applied arts and move on to the RCA.
Okay, because I think the excellent Hans Stouffer would have headed up the department at that time. So did you want to be a jewelry designer, or did you have other motives for being there?
No, not at all. Actually, if anything, the program was the title of it, goldsmithing, silversmithing, metalwork and jewelry was something that really put me off. But then when I met Hans and spoke to Hans and kind of understood his practice a bit more, I kind of got what the program was about. And interestingly, on the fourth floor where our studios were, on the top of the door, there was the sign that the college put up with the program title on there, goldsmithing, silversmithing, metalwork, jewelry. And somebody right at the end with a marker wrote, and stuff. And that was essentially why I went to the RCA, and in particular that program, is because of the openness and the stuff that was being created there. That wasn't just jewelry and wasn't just working with metals, but it was a lot more than that. It was kind of just feeding and exploring and understanding a practice through materials, through processes, and developing that in various different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also quite important to point out that you don't just work in orange peel, Alkesh. There's often, more than a nod to your Indian heritage in some of your other work. Can we talk about the project Beyond Powder and the thinking behind that? Because it's based around Holi, the festival of colour.
Beyond the Powder is a relatively new research project that I've undertaken, but it kind of stemmed from the first time I went to India, which was back in 2016. So my parents weren't actually born in India. They're East African Asians, and I've been to Kenya multiple times, and kind of every time I went there, I really visited the places my parents were born and visited my grandparents and related to the East African Asian part of me. But when I went to India for the first time back in 2015, it just really opened up so much more in terms of my cultural background, and I related to so many different things. And there were also things that I didn't relate to. So for me, when I was there, I really wanted to go and experience and celebrate the Holi festival, whereas in the UK, it would essentially just happen in the evening because it was the only time people were out of work and where the park was available to celebrate it. So you didn't really appreciate the vibrancy of the colors, etc. But when I went there the first time, I decided not to go into Vrindavan and Mathura, the kind of birthplace of Lord Krishna and Radha, where a lot of that festival is celebrated, where many people go and visit and celebrate the festival. I decided to go and experience it in a small village, and it was such an amazing experience because it was within a small community of people. And what I was really struck by was the remnants of color that was left over after the festival, and the ephemeral nature of that. So it was only there for a day or 2 days, and some traces of colors stayed on maybe for a bit longer. And I came back here really thinking about wanting to do something and wanting to intervene within that process of whilst that celebration was happening, to capture some of that ephemeral nature of the Holi festival. So it was a project that I've had kind of at the back of my head for many years. But this year I went back to India to visit the festival. And this time I decided to go to Vrindavan and Mathura, where hundreds of thousands of people go to visit over the period of a couple of weeks. And for me, what was really important was to document the process and document the lead up to the Holi festival. Document actually the interactions and engagements that happen around the color itself. So how people sell the color, how they buy them, what makes them want to buy them, the packaging around that. And a lot of that actually stemmed from doing further research around the color itself and the pigments that the color is made up of. So I did some research and found that a lot of the color pigments are actually synthetically manufactured. So they're synthetic dyes that tend to get mixed with a starch-based material. Gulal is the term they used.
Which presumably can't be that good for you.
No, not at all. And again, this is the angle I was kind of approaching this research from, which was quite sensitive. There's a lot of tension there at times, but the synthetic dyes are kind of made up of highly complex chemical polymers. And these polymers kind of end up in the soil and water ecosystems. And they contain compounds such as lead oxide, diesel, copper sulfates. So yes, the environmental aspect is really quite concerning, but also the human health implications of it. So for me, going out there, I documented the festival. So it's a festival of color. It's a festival which is the marking of the advent of spring. It has a deep-rooted significance within the Hindu tradition and ecology in its own way. But what I found really interesting with the Holi festival is that traditionally the colors would be made from natural sources such as turmeric or neem or flowers, which would get, soaked into water overnight, and you'd throw the color around you play Holi the following day. And I found also culturally the way in which people played Holi was different through my research. So, through oral histories and kind of speaking to people who lived.
In what way, Alkesh?
In the way in which traditionally and previously people would apply these natural color pigments onto their hand and rub them into the skin. And the process and act of rubbing into the skin with ingredients such as turmeric was a process of kind of cleansing the skin. Whereas now a lot of the younger generations actually pelt and throw the powder at you. And there's very little barriers in terms of whether you want to kind of have color thrown at you or thrown in your eyes. So it was really fascinating to kind of capture some of those histories, but also understand how people played today. I tried to actually go and visit some of these color factories where they make the synthetic dyes and synthetic colors, but they wouldn't give me access for obvious reasons, mainly.
Yeah. Okay. Is there a product that comes out of this? You're laughing. It's a piece of research at the moment.
It's a piece of research at the moment, but I did make some site interventions while I was out there. I was really wanted to keep the essence of me going out there and wanting to capture aspects of that ephemeral nature of the Colour Festival. So what I did initially, or just before the morning of the main Holi Festival day, is I went around different parts of the town, Vrindavan, and placed watercolour papers outside temples and different streets around those areas where the festival takes place, and then went back after the festival had ended to retrieve them. So basically ended up capturing these really kind of beautiful prints of the festival, which kind of captured the ephemeral aspect of it and almost have become artifacts in their own way.
Alkesh, we've run out of time. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Final question, obviously. You have Material Matters coming up any day now, but what are your plans after that?
So I'm looking forward to the show, by the way, Grant.
Thanks. We're looking forward to having you.
But after that, I think I'll be taking some time to focus on teaching to begin with, but also I've just moved into a new place. So there's lots of stuff I need to and want to get in order.
It's home improvement is what you're saying.
It is a little bit of home improvement.
Future for you is teaching and home improvement. Okay, that's good.
Teaching, home improvement. And actually, I've just come back from Slovenia, Ljubljana. So there's potentially a residency that I'll be doing there at a fantastic place called Rog, which is an old bicycle factory that they've spent 14 years planning to create. So they have an incredible makerspace / restaurant and residency apartments there as well. So maybe even a residency before that as well, before the end of the year.
Alkesh, thoroughly enjoyed that. I will see you very, very soon. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Grant. See you soon.
You can find out more about Alkesh at his brand new website, which is studioarp.uk. And remember, the Material Matters Fair runs from the 18th to the 21st of September at Bargehouse, Oxo Tower Wharf. Admission is free for trade, but you must register in advance. I'll put a link in the blurb that comes with this episode. As ever, to find other podcasts I've done and sign up to our newsletter, go to materialmatters.design. And there are images relating to the interviews on our Instagram page, which is also materialmatters.design. And it would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £2.50 a month, you can receive an invite to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message, the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening, and hope to see you soon.